It was actually March of 2020, right before the pandemic started. And, like a lot of universities went on spring break, and there's this COVID going around. It might turn into a pandemic, it might not. But the week after spring break, we're going to go online to see if we need to stay online or not. And I knew right away, everyone's going to be working from home. Universities are never going back. So I went to my Best Buy and bought a Blue Yeti and a Logitech. I'm like, this will sell out immediately. And they did. I was like, I got in while the getting was good.
You were an early adopter.
I was an early adopter. I did fool around with OBS a little bit because I was like, I had been following people on Twitch, artists and stuff like that. And so I was like, what if I did like a kind of, lectures on Twitch or something like. Mostly I just wanted an excuse to fool around with OBS and see if I could make it work. So I'm kind of familiar with some things. I abandoned that, but yeah, I have the Blue Yeti and I have the Logitech 922 or something, whatever it was. But yeah,
you've got a pretty good setup.
I mean, decent enough for what I need, right? I always say yes to podcast interviews, and I do quite a bit of them. And I also do a lot of, I'll get a lot of meetings with people like History Channel, Netflix, National Geographic, Smithsonian, like talking head stuff, And so whenever I meet with those producers, I always want to bring it. I don't want to half step it with some little cheesy, laptop camera and stuff like
constantly cutting in and out.
Yeah. But yeah. Recently,
Oh no!
Yeah, go ahead.
No.
I was recently, and this really was driven home to me. I recently did a consultation with a movie director who's doing a movie through A24. I don't know if you know A24 Productions.
Absolutely.
They do all the crazy and fun horror movies, right? So it's a guy named Hiro Murai who directed a lot of the Atlanta shows, Atlanta and The Bear and all that kind of stuff. He directed a lot of that, and he's like, I want to do this, movie, my first full length movie on samurai stuff, and can you be a consultant? So I had a meeting with him and a script writer. I was like, all right, I gotta bring my, I can't half step it. That's right, yeah. So anyway.
Is that what a lot of your consulting work for film and stuff centers around? Is your work on the samurai?
Yeah, this little book that came out that I did on the samurai through Oxford, that really kind of led to a lot of public engagement stuff, because that series, that whole very short introduction series, is a kind of public-facing series, and a lot of journalists and producers, they'll go to those books if they need to know something about like Shakespeare or Vikings or whatever it might be, right? And so when I published that little book on the samurai, that led to a lot of stuff. And then I always ask, when a producer calls me, like, how did you find out? Because I'm always interested in some anthropological sense, always interested in like, how do these things get produced, and they're like, oh, you were on a list. So I think once you do one thing, then you're on the list of like, hey, this person is not horrible, right?
You've got a little name recognition for people.
Right, that's right.
He's not a total fringe guy. He's done some work. We can trust what he's saying.
Yeah. Because some people don't do well on camera either. I've been to some production things where, they'll invite 12 historians. And then I always ask, when we're on the downtime or having a beer afterwards, was there anyone who wasn't really good? And there's always someone who's like, yeah, there's this one professor and they were just like deer in the headlights and they couldn't talk, they couldn't do anything, So there is a bit of acting to it as well, I think.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I've noticed that just doing this. Once the camera comes on, people are either, they find a groove and they can kind of carry it, or like you said, they're a deer in headlights. They just freeze up. They lose all access to recall, and you're just met with one sentence answers. It's like, oh, okay. Yeah. Great talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Alrighty then. Right. Yeah. And I think too, I kind of get it. Like, I was on a panel for BBC Radio, and there was like a pretty famous Japanese historian who was on this panel. And she's usually very, eloquent and great. And she was kind of hesitant. And afterwards she said, I was so afraid of saying the wrong thing, because you're recorded. And if you get some detail wrong, it's wrong forever. And, I think everyone should have. There's a certain acceptance of failure. You make mistakes, right? And you just got to go with it. So
Well, and some of that must be challenging because accounts vary between historians. You could have two
yeah,
historians on the same subject who have different
yeah,
explanations for why an event happened the way that it did or the
yeah.
repercussions from that event.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, different views and yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Yep.
How does that
Yep.
work when you're working on a project like this? Do they group all of you together to kind of get your story straight to some aspect, or are you more
Like
in line with
during
the
an
script? Like when you're doing a
uh
talking head presentation.
okay, yeah, yeah. So the way that it typically works is like right now I'm doing this with I'm under an NDA, so I guess I can say with a famous media production company of sorts, and they have what are called beat sheets, which is not exactly a script, but it is a list of questions and possible responses that you could give, which you're not beholden to at all. But the beat sheets are a way for the production company to say, this is what we're looking for. This is what our research has kind of revealed. Tell us where we're wrong, fix things. And so there are either beat sheets or there will be, pages and pages of questions, not all of which will be asked, but will allow the speaker to get a sense of what it is the production company wants.
The kind of
Yeah,
direction
yeah,
they're going to take you guys.
yeah, yeah. So I've never had a production company tell me to say something that I didn't believe in or wasn't true. But there is, they are looking for a certain phraseology that's more engaging than other phraseologies, right? And so I think that's part of the talking head gig is knowing how to phrase something that a producer will go, "Oh yeah, the way you put that is gonna sound great on camera," right? And I'm sympathetic to that argument, yeah, to that
Well,
way of doing
I would
things.
imagine your work as an educator kind of comes in handy there because you have to keep students
Absolutely.
engaged in what you're teaching. Otherwise, everyone's just going to zone out.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you've hit it exactly right. Like little anecdotes or metaphors or comparisons to other things that I would think would sound great, or things that I've heard like, oh, that's a great way of putting that. I got to put that in my lecture. Yeah, yeah, that engagement stuff for sure, for sure.
How did you become interested in the samurai? What was your journey there?
Well, I mean, that's kind of a tricky question because I'm not really like a samurai expert. In the beginning of my career, like no one goes and does a PhD in samurai as such. I have a PhD in East Asian history, and my focus is on Japan, pre-modern Japan mostly. And through writings I had done before, I was approached by an editor who was like, we have a couple of projects. Would you be interested in any of them? And one of them was this samurai project. And so I thought, oh, this is a nice kind of bridge from my previous project to my next one, thinking more about the samurai and stuff like that. So that's really how I got into writing about samurai. Was as a part of just a journey of Japanese history. Now, Japanese history interest is another story, but yeah.
How did the Japanese interest come into view?
Yeah, I'm such a cliche of the Gen X male age group. In the 90s, I was a karate kid. I was big into martial arts, still do martial arts. But that interest in high school in martial arts led to an interest in Japan and Japanese culture and all that kind of, stereotypical mystique of Asia type stuff that's common of my generation and probably the older generation as well. And so when I was in college, I majored in East Asian studies and I took as many Japanese language courses as I could with the goal of graduating and then going over to Japan to just, study martial arts, work in Japan, improve my Japanese language. At that point, I had never really considered being a professor or anything like that. I just wanted to do the things that I wanted to do. And that's kind of the start of all of this, I would say. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they say with my generation, I guess, and a little bit before me, you either become a history buff or you get into smoking meat. Those are the two trade-offs. You either start going down the World War II route and watching a ton of documentaries on that,
Right.
or you get into smoking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. That's funny. A lot of my students now most of them are like the manga and anime. They're really into the Japanese pop culture stuff. And some, like an older generation of Japanese historian, they kind of grumble about that, but I welcome it because it's like, if it weren't for manga and anime folks, we'd be out of a job, right? Unless you have the rare student who's into World War II as such, and they are around, but really it's like the pop culture, that they're into.
And it's almost
Um,
whatever gets somebody interested, whatever opens the door for them,
yeah,
regardless of
yeah,
what it is, as long as they're coming in.
that's right. Not judging the journey, as I like to say. But
So for the samurai specifically, I actually read your introduction. That's kind of
oh,
how I came
thanks.
across it. It was a great book.
Oh, thanks. Very kind of you. Very kind of you.
How do you So for people that aren't familiar, how would you describe the current popular view of what the samurai are? And then we'll get into kind of your breakdown past that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I would say the popular view is that samurai are a Japanese warrior from pre-modern Japan that exists as a kind of monolith. That is to say, they all have the same views on things, the same ethics, the same morality. And that would include things like death before dishonor and loyalty and expertise in martial arts, especially swordsmanship and this sort of thing. I would say that's pretty much the zeitgeist about samurai. What I kind of like about how popular culture has pushed back against this is that for the kids who read a lot of manga and watch a lot of anime and even a lot of Japanese movies on samurai, they begin to understand that, like not all samurai are honorable. A lot of them are poor. A lot of them are not at all good at martial arts, right? Not all of them are very honorable at all. So there is a kind of like, oh yeah, the popular culture is kind of moving in the right direction, as it were. In the United States, which is a reflection of how popular culture in Japan has depicted samurai, which is a kind of different beast altogether. Yeah.
Do you think that the current interpretation of samurai from a Japanese perspective is more realistic nowadays than it may have been in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every era has its own vision or fantasy about samurai, right? So if we were in 1930s and we're totally into the fascist era in Japan, there's going to be one view of the samurai where death before dishonor is very much going to be part of how samurai are depicted in film and in novels and such. And then there's the kind of 1960s, 1970s view of the samurai, which is, that that the modern businessman is loyal to his company like a samurai is loyal to his lord, like the good cog in the wheel type vision of the samurai,
Would
right?
never leave even if presented with a better
That's
offer.
right. That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So every era has its own vision of the samurai. But I think, I'm not a huge watcher of contemporary Japanese samurai films. But yeah, it seems like things like Twilight Samurai, the movie Twilight Samurai, has a really nice depiction of samurai, a low-ranking samurai, rank-and-file samurai, and things like that. So I think, yeah, the depiction is a little bit more accurate nowadays in Japanese popular culture version of samurai, for sure.
Do you think that just comes with time and going back over the history and seeing it more for what it actually was without all the grandeur?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I do think it has to do a lot with, producers and directors doing a lot of research. And in Japanese language, there's a lot of great research. There's a lot of great public facing research about samurai. So it's easier for producers to get a sense of what was going on that might be more historically accurate in some sense than in the past. And there's less pressure. I mean, of course, if we're in the 1930s, there's a lot of censorship and this sort of thing, right? And to a certain extent, I mean, the political and cultural context is always going to matter in the depiction of anything in any country, right? But I think as it concerns samurai, maybe there's not as much pressure, or the zeitgeist to depict the samurai in a certain way isn't as great as it once was. Yeah. Is kind of my kind of amateurish view of popular culture, right? I'm not really an expert on popular culture in Japan, but that's what I would say. Yeah.
One of the surprising things in reading your book and kind of branching out to more modern sources on the samurai was how that idea of loyalty
Mm.
really comes into play as just a human dynamic. That you can fudge it. Yeah, you're loyal to your emperor or to the shogun, but maybe you don't actually think they're the right person or they don't have the right claim to the throne. And so you can fudge that loyalty to someone who you do believe has a right to claim it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, loyalty, like if we had to go through like the top 5 myths about the samurai or something like that, certainly the notion of loyalty is up there in that top 5. I would say before the Tokugawa period, so before the 1600s, and just as an aside, when we see samurai in popular culture, it's mostly samurai of that Tokugawa period. Like the shaved head and the top knot. When you see that, boom, you're in the Tokugawa period, 1600 1868, somewhere in there. But when we're talking about before that time period, especially in the Warring States period, which is a lot of the Kurosawa films of old, then all bets are off in terms of loyalty. I mean, you don't even have to fudge things, right? Your warlord loses and you're out of a job. You join the new warlord if he offers you a job. Easy peasy, right? There's no there's no question about that. And I would say throughout much of that pre-Tokugawa era, even going all the way back to the 1200s and 1100s, there's a lot of that switching sides if it's convenient and beneficial. Now, there are always going to be a group of people who maybe are very close to a warlord who will remain loyal and in some extreme cases might even, kill themselves if their lord is killed. But that would have been very extreme in the pre-Tokugawa period. Once we get into the Tokugawa period, it's interesting because now everything is kind of settled in terms of warfare. We don't have any more macro violence. Warlords become more like lords, and there's no real competition. The oldest son of the lord is always going to be the next lord. Maybe that new lord is going to be a tool, just a complete idiot. So what you do is you're loyal not to the lord, but to the house, to the clan and the legacy and that kind of thing. And, so you can grumble, oh yeah, the lord's kind of an idiot, but granddad was this great warrior and, we're loyal to that kind of thing, right? And that's how people kind of justify, remaining in place in their domain and following the edicts and that sort of thing. Yeah.
That was another interesting idea at play is the bureaucratic bloat. What happens to a warrior culture when there is no war to fight? And what happens to the warriors involved in that culture?
Yeah. That is a fantastic question. And this book I'm writing now kind of gets into that. Like, right. I forget which historian said it. It wasn't me, but I certainly use it in the book and in my lectures and when I go on TV and stuff. And that is, warriors go from being sword wielding warriors to pencil pushing sword wearing warriors, right? They're essentially bureaucrats who are wearing a sidearm, right? In some sense, they're putting on their masculinity, but in their job, they're doing quite something just drudgery. And so how do samurai as individuals feel about that? And more importantly, what I'm kind of writing about now is how do lords and the shogunate, how do they really try to project this fantasy of what it means to be a real warrior onto people who are not engaged in warfare really ever and will probably never engage in warfare. And I even say in this book, I call it LARPing essentially, right? There's a lot of live action role playing by samurai of what it means to be a samurai, right? But it's a serious LARP in the sense that when there is rebellion, or especially at the end of the Tokugawa period, yeah, people will die out of that ideology, right? Even though they might have never expected to. So it's a LARP, but it's a serious LARP. Like it's a LARP that turns deadly in some sense. And I think the real takeaway of that message is that can happen in any time period, right? It can happen right now, right, in the United States. So, yeah.
And there are powerful ideals that drive that culture specifically. And you can use that as kind of a weapon, especially the loyalty aspect and what you owe to, the people that you're supporting in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the Aizu domain, which is, Aizu domain is the domain where Fukushima, 311 and the earthquake and the tsunami and all that prefecture was a prefecture loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate and the Tokugawa clan specifically. And they're on the losing side of the Meiji Restoration of 1868, that kind of civil war, if you will, that starts modern Japan. They're on the losing side of that. And during that battle of 1868 into 1869, when they're on the losing side, there are even samurai women who engage in the fighting, and when they think they're going to lose, they kill themselves. Even though most of their lives, and I shouldn't say most of their lives, their entire lives had been relatively peaceful, as had their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, right? But they're willing to kill themselves, when push comes to shove. And why is that? How does that work structurally? That's kind of the things I'm kind of thinking about even now, in my writing.
That idea of suicide or seppuku, it wasn't as predominant as you might expect prior to the Tokugawa period, especially, like you're saying. That was surprising to me. I thought that was just inherent from the beginning.
Yeah. I guess that would be another one of those myths. And maybe if we move this to the top 10, right? Yeah, I mean, suicide upon the death of one's lord or master happened before the Tokugawa period, but as you say, very infrequent. And really, in some sense, is influenced by Chinese literature, popular literature, and this notion in China that one can follow one's lord unto death. But it was kind of rare. I mean, if your warlord lost, why kill yourself? Just get a new warlord, right? Work for the new guy. But as part of this identity crisis for samurai in the Tokugawa period, that becomes institutionalized, this seppuku, right? This ritual disembowelment. And there are even manuals on how to do seppuku and how to be a second in the seppuku, because the idea is, cutting open your stomach hurts and it takes a while to bleed out. So you have a friend or trusted swordsman who's going to decapitate you to kind of end the suffering, right? So how to be a second and, how to do things properly. There are manuals on that. And that's been translated into English, this collection of manuals. But that all becomes institutionalized at exactly the moment when warfare kind of disappears in Japan, right? And it's the same with martial arts. Like most people, even among people I know who do martial arts, and I don't mean like modern martial arts like judo or karate, but like swordsmanship and older martial arts. They still kind of believe in some sense that the origins of all this goes into the, pre-Tokugawa period and something like that. And the reality is martial arts as an institutional set of practices and beliefs starts in the Tokugawa period, exactly at the moment when martial arts are the least useful in some functional sense, right? And that's just, it's just crazy stuff, right? It's wonderful stuff, yeah.
It's a crazy idea for that to take hold. Because in most cultures, you would assume that that's almost the coward's way out, to take your own life.
Mm-hmm.
But for the samurai, it seems that the idea was that stabbing yourself in the stomach was the most painful way to go, correct? And that this was kind of more powerful than just taking a coward's way out. You were doing this knowing how painful it was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, you were doing this. I mean, I think a lot of samurai, especially once seppuku becomes a common practice into the later 1600s and certainly in 1700s and 1800s, they know that a second is going to cut the head off, right? So they know the pain's going to end quickly. But the idea is, my life is going to end, but in killing myself, I preserve the family. Like my family will get to continue to live and they might be supported financially by the domain. And so my individual death is much better than the kind of social death of my entire family. And if I were to run away or something like that, then they would probably, punish the whole family, really, and the whole legacy. Yeah, there's this wonderful movie that I think kind of depicts this well. And in English, I think it's called Harakiri. It's a movie from the 60s, but it's about this samurai who goes around, and he's a poor samurai, and he kind of pressures domains into giving him money by saying, "Oh, I'm a poor samurai. I'm knocking at your door, and if I can't get any money, my life is worthless. So I have to do seppuku on your grounds, and you have to monitor it." And it suddenly becomes a burden. It's much easier. The idea being, it's much easier for the daimyo to say, "Here's a few gold coins, and I'll get out of here. You're causing us problems." But then there's one daimyo who says, "Okay, you want to do seppuku? Fine." And he kind of has a oh crap moment, like now he's got to do it. And then they make him do it with a bamboo sword, so it's really painful and slow. Yeah, it's a really brutal movie, but I think it kind of is an accurate depiction of how some samurai try to game this, and the pressures that samurai have, and all this kind of stuff.
Guilt somebody into giving you a couple extra bucks.
That's right. That's right.
And as long as we're dispelling myths around them, the fact that some samurai cheated and stole and gambled and engaged in activities that you wouldn't necessarily attribute to that idea.
Oh yeah, there's a wonderful autobiography translated into English, out of print but very inexpensive online, called Musui's Story. And it's about a samurai. This is late in the Tokugawa period, where the population of samurai has really grown, and there are just not a lot of jobs for samurai within a domain. And even when there are jobs, they're seasonal or irregular, and they don't pay very well. And so, yeah, selling swords, gambling, doing fortune telling, joining informal gangs are all ways to kind of make a living and survive, essentially. I mean, some samurai will teach swordsmanship to commoners for extra money. Some will engage in activities that aren't necessarily illegal, but are seen as very un-samurai-like. For example, they'll make toys or umbrellas or something like that and sell them on the side. And some even might have a small plot of land and kind of be a mini farmer of sorts informally. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of funny nastiness that goes on, I would say.
Yeah, once you look beneath the surface, you realize, oh, it actually wasn't this clean and proper image.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's why I always refer to samurai. A lot of people will call samurai a class, like the class of samurai. But when I think of the word class, I usually think of it in terms of economics, like middle class, working class, this kind of thing. And as a class, they don't really work as a class, right? There are a small group of wealthy samurai, but then there's a huge group of rank and file samurai who are barely making ends meet and economically are struggling. So I think of them as a kind of a status group. But yeah, there's a lot of discrimination within the samurai group, and economics plays into that quite a lot. Yeah.
How does this group and this culture take hold in pre-modern Japan? What is the setting that allows them to flourish and grow?
Right. Well, if we're talking, should we go with the Tokugawa period, I guess,
or even prior to that? Because the idea began. I mean, I know that it kind of culminated in the Tokugawa period, but even before that, the idea of a samurai as the servant and this warrior was still taking place, correct?
Yeah, right. We could go back, let's just say safely, I think we could say the 800s AD, right? Or Common Era is when we have warriors, or, let's just call them samurai, who serve the court. They serve the court in Kyoto, where the emperors live, where there's a nobility, a mostly civilian nobility. And they depend on people to act as tax collectors, to manage the countryside in terms of security. They also act as a kind of police, going after rebels or, rebellions, that sort of thing. And although in Japan at that time they did kind of have a Chinese-style conscript army, the reality is conscript armies don't always do so well, right? Like, people don't want to be in a conscript army, right? And they have to arm themselves and this sort of thing. So very quickly after Japanese hegemons kind of abandon the Tang Dynasty Chinese-style conscript army, they just grow to depend upon minor nobility whose career goals are fulfilled by kind of controlling men at arms, right? And so when we get into the 900s and, after the year 1000 or so, you have court nobles who, there's a whole hierarchy of nobility. They're all based in Kyoto. And the very lower rung of those nobles are nobles who are also, in a sense, warriors. So in the book, I call them like noble hyphen warriors, right? And those would be very elite people in society at large. They're raised in Kyoto. They have wet nurses. They have connections to nobility that are more important than they are, who have no war making capabilities at all. But they kind of monopolize the need for almost like a national guard or policing functions. And I would say that throughout the 1000s into the 1100s, maybe even into the 1200s, it's very much the court in Kyoto that's in charge. And you have more and more of these court nobles who are minor nobility, who are warriors, who have men under them who are, part-time warriors, retainers, vassals, soldiers who fight on behalf of that warrior noble who himself is bound to the court in Kyoto, right? Once we get into the late 1200s and into the 1300s, that group of warriors becomes more and more important as political power players themselves. And a lot of the political de facto power begins to shift slightly away from Kyoto to wherever warriors kind of have their own capital city of such. First in Kamakura, which is a day trip south from Tokyo, and then in Kyoto itself under a Muromachi district, a district called Muromachi. And so if we were to generalize, there's gradually that shift more and more towards the shogunate and the government of the warriors, by the warriors, for the warriors, if you will. But even then, we get this odd situation where who exactly qualifies or would be considered a samurai is kind of vague. We get a lot of what I like to think of as, kind of like the character from Braveheart, guys who are farming most of the time, but they got a sword underneath their roof. And when it's time to go to war, they pull the sword out and they go join the army and the warlord, and then they go to battle, right? Would we consider that person a samurai as such or not really? Things are kind of up in the air. And so that kind of vagueness really solidifies in the 1600s, where you have to be born as a samurai, and it's quite clear, okay, samurai aren't farming anymore. They're definitely living in cities, and they look like this, and, this sort of thing. Yeah.
The idea of the shogun coming into play as essentially this governor or this general to expel barbarians from the region. It's kind of impressive that they were able to use that power and circumvent the emperor to some extent. And then they get circumvented in this idea of a regent controlling the shogun, controlling the emperor, and how that power dynamic, it almost became ingrained in the system. And then they're the leader now, essentially.
Yeah, it's I like the way you put that there's this kind of complex dynamic and circumventing. It's funny because when the shogun title first starts, it's a very temporary title. It's not a very important title. And, the shogun who's probably the most famous, Yoritomo, who creates the Kamakura shogunate, the first shogunate in Japanese history, he has a lot of other titles, and the title he's really interested in are these noble titles that kind of situate him in the court nobility in Kyoto, right? So he doesn't really care so much about being shogun, and it's only his widow, when he dies, his widow, who says to the warriors, "Hey, at the very end of the day, he was a warrior, and he was a warrior leader, so you should back the Kamakura shogunate," right? But even after him, there's there are shoguns who are not warriors at all. They're adopted from civilian noble families in Kyoto who have never trained and don't have any access to warriors really at all. And so the shogun status is an on again, off again. Is it important? Is it not important? To what degree is it important? And I would venture to say it's really only with the Tokugawa shogunate that the whole shogun position becomes the de facto hegemonic political position in Japan. And that's not until the 1600s, right? And then what happens is the Tokugawa shogunate depicts history backwards, saying, well, all the shoguns were important and the shogun was always an important title and yada, 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 this kind of thing. Yeah.
What is the perception of the average Japanese citizen at that time, especially as you're watching a shogun be installed and it's a child or an infant, and then people are obviously kind of ruling behind the scenes, right? Are people looking towards the emperor as a source of power in that, or they're just going along to get along?
Yeah, I guess there are two ways to answer that. I mean, they're really, one of the things I always say to my students in my pre-modern Japanese history classes, before 1800, there are no Japanese, right? There are no Japanese people. There's no national identity or nation state called Japan, really, except for among the elite. So most Japanese people have no idea what's going on. They don't really care at all. And no one really cares about their opinion at all, right? It really is the hegemons at the top that are ruling things. In fact, most people living in Japan up until maybe the late 1700s or 1800s, they don't even know what an emperor is, let alone who it is. They will have a sense, 1600s onwards, that, the guy who kind of sets all the rules is this guy called a shogun, and it's a guy with a Tokugawa last name. Otherwise, most, kind of commoners before the Tokugawa period would say, okay, who's the local power holder? Who's the local warlord? That's the guy in charge. And maybe, off in Kyoto, there are all these other kinds of people who are, important for some reason, but they have no salience in the lives of anyone, really. Except for maybe, people living in the city of Kyoto or for warriors or something like that. So they don't really care, and the elites have no salience in the lives of everyday Japanese people in pre-modern Japan. I would say really it's kind of maybe 10% of the Japanese population in the pre-modern world. And this is just a figure I'm throwing out there. It's not a quotable figure, but in other words, the people who are elites, who have control over land, which is how wealth is measured, who have access to warriors or local, loyal guys. Those are the only people who are really concerned about what's going on in Kyoto and what's going on with the politics of the emperor and the shogun and this kind of thing.
It's just so far away from everyday life.
Yeah.
That it's just an abstraction at that point.
Yeah.
You're just worried about your local lord who's coming down and telling you what to do.
Yeah. The guy who's coming and collecting taxes, right? How do I satisfy that, or how do I negotiate that? How do I deal with that? That's the concern. That's the concern.
Less about the politics, especially in the city that's far away and you probably haven't been to.
Right. Absolutely. Yep.
So it kind of culminates in the Tokugawa period. How does it start to decline? Is it that bureaucratic bloat in the mid-19th century that it just starts to decay as you have these warriors who aren't engaging in war, are really just, again, bureaucrats or aristocrats trying to engage in the arts, and the system just crumples?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say if we start from the bottom up, the average commoner doing some kind of agricultural work, doing some trading on the side, maybe a local industry or something like that. Most of those people don't really care, and they're not really involved in the political decline as such. There are a couple times during the Tokugawa period where you'll have natural disaster. You'll have a volcano explode and that'll destroy crops. And because of the way agriculture works as a commodity in the Tokugawa period, where you're selling local agricultural goods to other parts of Japan. And so any kind of food that would alleviate the suffering of bad crops or natural disaster are actually just a commodity sent somewhere else. That leads to a lot of unrest in certain parts of Japan in the Tokugawa period. But other than those moments of unrest, which are significant, it does lead to the spread of famine and in some places even cannibalism. Other than that, most commoners are just doing their own thing, right? I think the decline is a growing frustration by lords who are politically shut out of the shogunate system. So they don't have access to policy decisions. And there's a growing presence of Westerners in the seas in East Asia, or, these people called Americans and British, doing trade in China and trying to come to Japan where they're forbidden to arrive. So there's this kind of pressure from the West. And there's also a kind of renewed, or maybe we should just call it a new sense that, hey, the emperor is kind of important for religious reasons and political reasons, and that the shogunate really isn't obsequious enough to the emperor. And so again, that kind of political frustration that culminates in a collapse, if you will, it really concerns maybe again that kind of 10% of that population, right? Most commoners are really not concerned with what's going on. And that collapse is also financial. A lot of money, a lot of gold leaving Japan because of arbitrage trade with Americans and British and other Westerners. A little bit of terrorism that results in the death of Westerners that the shogunate has to pay indemnities for, even though they don't have control over the lords where samurai are terrorizing Westerners. And so all that whole kind of thing, that's really where the political frustrations come in. Yeah, is the politics and the economics at the top.
Do you think had the West, had their intervention in Japan been pushed back, it would have remained the status quo with the shogunate specifically?
Yeah,
do you think it kind of would have pushed it back?
That's a very good question. I think the Tokugawa shogunate might have lasted a little bit longer. I mean, even within the Tokugawa shogunate, and I got into a little bit of this issue in my first book, which is a boring book that no one should read or buy. But
I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking about reading. Is this the Meiji Restoration one?
Yeah, Meiji Restoration Losers. Yeah, it's more of like a classic academic monograph, so it's not really that interesting for most people. But there was this sense among some of those guys who worked for the Tokugawa shogunate, like, oh wow, the whole system of having lords who are relatively autonomous collecting tax just for themselves, there's no national tax, no national army, right? Everything is kind of split up. That is not a great way to have a strong country. And really, we should learn from the Americans and the British and kind of get rid of this whole system and have something like a constitutional monarchy or something like that, where we can actually have a nation state like the West has. That idea exists even within the shogunate, but only among a handful of people. But nonetheless, there is the sense like, oh, wow, something has to change because Japan is weak, because our political structure is just kind of disjointed. And it worked for a long time because it was relatively flexible and there are no rebellions and we don't have to, there's no threat from outside. Everything kind of works in a very, as I like to say, usefully ambiguous way. But that breaks apart, I think, because of the intrusion of the West. Yeah. So I would say it would have lasted a little bit longer, but still there would have had to have been some major structural change at some point. Yeah.
Does that idea that they need to unify against the West in some way, or adopt that Western structure, does that diminish the clan structure that they have? Does that also fall as the shogunate starts to fall?
Yeah. This notion that identity being local, like I'm a Satsuma domain samurai or an Aizu domain samurai, and loyal to the local, the Lord's family, if not the Lord himself. And, one scholar even called this like domainal nationalism, like it's a nationalism, but only in your own domain. And there are like 260, 270 some domains, right? And so, yes, that absolutely has to fall. And so after the Meiji Restoration, that's exactly what happens. Like, the oligarchy that is created, the samurai who create a modern government from our point of view, one of the first things they do is they get rid of the domains, and they get rid of the samurai status group. A lot of samurai and daimyo are actually kind of okay with this, because it's like, oh, we're not stuck in this position. Like we can do other things now. But then there are a lot who are very emotionally attached to it, right? And that leads to violence eventually. But yeah, no, definitely this idea that everything being split up and everyone's collecting their own tax locally and they have their own little local armies, that is not how you have a strong country. The samurai themselves are the ones who recognize this and change it in the 1870s. Yeah, yeah.
I would imagine some of the favorability in regards to that structure falling apart depends on kind of your position in it, right? If you're close to the courts, if you have a position of high standing, maybe you don't want the samurai ethos to kind of fade away. Whereas if you're a little more abstract, a little farther from Kyoto, yeah, why? Why keep this?
Yeah, I would say Kyoto and Edo, which becomes Tokyo, right? Edo, where the shogunate is. Yeah, the guys who really lead the Meiji Restoration and who become those modern oligarchs are almost, I say almost just to guard myself, but really probably all of them were low-ranking samurai, right? They didn't really have a stake in their position as high-ranking samurai, right? And so in some sense, they're more willing, they have more of an ideal of change at the national level. They're not really invested in their own position, symbolic position as low-ranking samurai. Yeah. But there are other low-ranking samurai who, because they have nothing else but their status, right? They're not wealthy, they really want to hold on to this, and that does turn to violence. It's funny, a lot of the daimyo are in fact very easy. They give up because a lot of them easily give up because they get a nice big stipend to go into retirement, and they don't have to worry about managing all these darn samurai and this huge bureaucracy. They just take that, golden parachute, and they're like, bye bye,
Cash out.
the cash out, baby. Yeah, that's right. Diamond hands forever, say those daimyo. Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like the way I start my new book is in 1869, the first assembly of soon-to-be ex-samurai, but they're still samurai, and there's, several hundred of them, and they're trying to figure out, what do we need to do? How do we make what is a post office supposed to look like? And what is, like just basic stuff of what's the government supposed to look like? How do we deal with, Western countries? What should we say? What to our diplomats to say to the British and the Americans? But the one topic that is the most heated discussion is none of that pragmatic stuff as we might think of it if we had to create a modern country, right? It really is a discussion of this guy's proposal that, hey, we should no longer be carrying swords in public, and seppuku is kind of backwards. We should outlaw that. And there are days spent on that discussion, and that guy gets shouted down, he gets fired, and he even gets his life threatened. Like, how dare you challenge this abstract notion of samurai-ness? It's our unique culture and blah, 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 right? Which is also why, as I say to my students, when it comes to the modern military, when there is a national army and a national navy created, samurai are kind of shut out of that. Because you can't, you need soldiers, not warriors. And there's a difference between a warrior and a soldier, right? In some sense, a soldier has to be part of a unit. They're not thinking of individual honor and things like that. They're thinking of the group, right? You need people who work as a group. And, samurai, they wanted to see themselves. Samurai also don't like the idea that commoners are joining the military. Oh my, like farmers and stuff, right? So we can kind of see why samurai are shut out of the military for the most part. I mean, not entirely, but for the most part, yeah.
It's interesting that idea kind of came into play later as well, though. with kamikaze pilots. The idea that you're going to self-sacrifice, essentially for the nation at this point.
Right. And so that's almost like for Kamikaze, that becomes like a mythical version of the samurai, that they are a modern samurai, and that
You're
really
tapping
gets.
into that ethos again.
Yes, 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 absolutely. I always tell the story to my students about how I met a kamikaze pilot when I was living in Japan back in the 90s.
What was that like?
It was funny because one doesn't often meet a kamikaze pilot if they do their job right.
Yeah, right? That's exactly what I'm thinking.
You have failed to fulfill your job title. Yeah. So when I taught public school English in Japan from 93. No, wait a minute. From 97 to 2000 or 97 to 99, 2 years. And a fellow teacher, a Japanese guy, invited me over for dinner. And a lot of Japanese households are multi-generational. And so granddad was there, and there was this flag, and it was one of these, Japanese imperial flags, like the sun and the red dot in the center and all the rays coming out of it. And it was behind, it was kind of framed, and it had all these people signing it. And in Japanese, it was like, good luck and, congratulations and this kind of thing. And so, we're eating and drinking. So I'm like, okay, what's this, what's this framed flag behind the, next to the dinner table? And the granddad was like, oh yeah, that was the flag I got when I graduated from Kamikaze pilot school. And these are like all the well-wishers. And he was like, I was 16 when I graduated from Kamikaze pilot school, and it was right at the end of the war. So the war had ended right after he had graduated. So
man, did he luck out?
Man, the timing is everything. Yeah,
right?
Really.
Wow. Yeah, count your blessings for that. Graduated at the perfect time.
That's
a couple years earlier, it might have been a little different.
A whole different thing. Yeah. Yeah.
How important was the religious dynamic at play in the fall as you have Catholicism start to intervene?
So the fall of Tokugawa shogunate, you mean?
Yeah, the fall. Yeah, essentially, because my understanding was this prior to them kind of locking the West out. Did you have these missionaries find their way in?
Yeah, so in the middle of the 1600s, or maybe the 1630s or so, Christianity is banned, completely banned in Japan. Westerners are locked out, and so most Catholics basically renounce their Catholicism. And there are, in the Southwest, there are small communities of basically underground Catholics. And so in terms of Western religions, there really is no role at all, of the fall of the Tokugawa period. But I would say that in the late 1700s, there is this growing notion that the mythology of the gods and goddesses, the kami, in other words, the divine beings, found in the ancient mythologies in Japan have a kind of political dimension to them when thinking about the emperor. And in fact, that's kind of how the emperor gets more respect is, among these people who, these intellectuals, these writers in Japan who combine that, what we would see as religious mythology with politics. Like what are the implications of these observations about the emperor and the imperial line being connected to divinity, essentially, and to gods. And that's I would say is part of the Meiji Restoration ideology, if you will, this kind of, renewed sense of the unseen world and gods and goddesses playing a role in what should happen in Japan. That has a role for some of the participants of the Meiji Restoration. But as I was telling, one of my graduate students in my modern Japanese history class, who has a lot of interest in religion because he's a practicing Lutheran, and I said, before the Meiji Restoration, there is no word for religion, and so religion essentially doesn't exist as a concept, right? Buddhism and Shinto and these kinds of things are all mixed together in the sense that this is the unseen world that somehow interacts in the profane world of everyday life. But but there is no concept of religion. The word for religion, shukyo in Japanese, is a borrowed word from English in the late 19th century, in the modern period, right? But yeah.
So they have these temples and Buddhist monks. They don't necessarily attribute that to a strict religious stance that we would today when you think of a monk.
Yeah, monks in the Tokugawa period, Buddhist monks, Buddhist temples are small, they're local. When someone dies, that might be buried or cremated and given a Buddhist name, a kind of name for the next world or rebirth or things like that. So they do function in what we would call religion, but no one was it is unimaginable to think of religion as the way we would think of it, like as like a separate category. In other words, it's just mixed up in everyday life in some sense. Now, there are Buddhist groups who were kind of strictly defined and made fun of each other, and like, the Nichiren Buddhist guys would say the Zen Buddhist guys are going to Buddhist hell and stuff like that. But that's all at play among Buddhist monks and clergy, like the people who are with a stake in the game. But for everyday people walking around, peasants and commoners and stuff like that, they know what Buddhas are and Bodhisattvas and all these different Buddhist beings, and they somehow intervene in this world. And there are also Shinto gods. Sometimes the Shinto gods are also Bodhisattvas, so like Shinto and Buddhism mix up and all that kind of stuff. And then that's all kind of more strictly defined in the modern period. Yeah.
Is that why Catholicism was able to take such a hold, as it was filling a void that really wasn't there?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I would say that once we get into the modern period and Catholicism is formally allowed to exist, and more importantly, Christianity in general, right? In the Tokugawa period and before the Tokugawa period, when Christianity is around, it's entirely Catholicism, right? As Jesuits, Franciscans, these types. And then once we get into the modern period, Christianity in general is formally allowed to be practiced. And so you get a lot of mostly Protestant missionaries going to Japan as part of the excitement in bringing what is seen as Western civilization to Japan. So you get a lot of like professors who are hired, Western professors, to build colleges in Japan and help set up post offices and factories and things like that. And so there's also, among especially American missionaries, this view that Japan is kind of a new opportunity. And so there are a lot of people who, maybe a lot is too much, but the Japanese people who convert to Christianity mostly convert out of a middle class intellectual sense that part of Western civilization, as seen from the point of view of the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s, is that Christianity is somehow connected there.
So it's just the allure aspect of the West.
Yes. Like, okay, we get these missionaries. They're really doing, what we would call social justice work in the villages and things like that. And they're also educated and helping set up schools. And they kind of like that aspect of Christianity. And so they will convert to Christianity, or they will convert out of a social justice sense or an intellectual sense. Like a lot of the professors at Tokyo Imperial University happen to be Christian. So, I, as a Japanese intellectual or Japanese writer, might also ask, what is this Christianity about? And decide to convert. That's not to discount, faith-based allure of Christianity, but certainly there's this kind of value-added aspect to it.
And the new shiny object at play.
Yes. There is this aspect, and I would say this is also true in the pre-modern period, even in China. Like when I teach about Christianity in pre-modern China, there was this view that, unlike Taoism and Buddhism, there is a kind of moral and ethical stoicism to Christianity that was attractive to some people in China, and we could also probably guess that's true in Japan as well. In other words, Buddhism kind of says, yes, there are things that are sins, killing, adultery, things like that. But really, especially with Taoist influenced Buddhism, all the kind of moral things like having multiple wives and things like that are not seen as sinful as such, whereas Christianity is seen as more rigorous. And so there's that kind of stoic appeal, I would say, for some converts. But yeah.
And so does the dam breaking and the West coming in, does that kind of culminate with the Americans coming on the scene?
Yeah, I would say so. If we're in the Tokugawa period, what we have are more British in China, and so they're in the seas around Japan, and also more Americans, especially as America becomes more and more of not simply a New England and East Coast country, but more of a West Coast country. And you get, the gold rush and more people in the Pacific Northwest and more whalers and things like that. And that's all happening in the early 19th century, right? So you get more people in the Pacific coast and the West Coast. And that means more people ending up in Japan through shipwrecks and through storms and things like that, and more Japanese people ending up in, Oregon and Washington State, because of shipwrecks and stuff like that. And more interest by American merchants in going to China. And when you go to China, Japan is on the way, right? So this need to stop somewhere for fuel and pick up shipwrecked people and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a combination of British and American interest in forming some kind of formal relations with Japan. And then there are also the Russians. The Russians, as the Russians always want, is a warm water port for their navy. And they see islands around Japan as being ripe for land leasing and setting up maybe a little naval base or something like that. And that kind of interest is there in the late 1700s. So I think, more of that kind of the presence of Westerners in East Asia in general is something that the shogunate is aware of. And I think the Opium Wars in China really are a big shock to the Japanese, to the Tokugawa shogunate, because they say, wow, this is China, the center of East Asian civilization. They're supposed to be the badasses. And they get beat by, these British barbarians. And that's like, oh, crap, that's an oh, crap moment for the Tokugawa shogunate, which a lot of people don't, normally think of, right?
Because if China can fall, what does that say for Japan?
Exactly. You got it exactly right. Yeah.
And I never knew that Japan went to war with Russia. I mean, it was only a year or two, correct? In the late 19th century.
Okay. So once we're in the modern period, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905. Oh yeah, big. That was a big event. And even President Roosevelt at the time, he writes in his memoir, like the only thing he can talk about to visitors to the White House is how the Japanese beat the Russians, and that got him into judo and things like that. And in fact, if anyone could do this at home, but if you look at the Google Analytics, where you can trace the occurrence of a word over time, and you go as far back as you can, you'll see that after 1905, there are lots of books with the title of Japan in it that suddenly spike. And so all around the Western world, there's this interest in Japan because they beat the Russians, and no one thought they could beat the Russians. I mean, it's Russia, for Christ's sake, right? Who's going to beat the Russians? And the funny thing, I was just finishing teaching World War II, and I remind my students, like, Roosevelt was really impressed how the Japanese did a sneak attack against Port Arthur controlled by the Russians, and how sneak attacks are a great move, right? And it's going to be a very different story during Pearl Harbor. But in 1905, man, that sneak attack strategy is really awesome from the American perspective.
It's great when it's not being used on you, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but that's a major war. And people all over Asia, even in India, kind of looked to that. It was like, wow, this is a great example of the Asians beating a white country at their game. So it was very influential, even though it was, as you say, a very short war. Yeah.
How were they able to hold them up? I'm assuming this was just Russian expansionism. They were looking for that warm water port. Japan looked like a easy target.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's a complicated discussion because it follows the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95, and it really has to do with who has influence in the Korean Peninsula. China wants influence there. Japan wants influence there. And then once China is kind of knocked out of that after the Chinese lose to Japan, Korean government kind of turns to Russia as their, hey, can you help us out? Because we're worried about Japan. And that kind of comes to a head. So it's really about Russia very interested in extending its Trans-Siberian Railroad into Manchuria, which is right there on the Korean border, and needing more influence in Korea. So yes, it is expansion, but it's mostly a kind of land expansion and influence into Manchuria and Korea that Russia is interested in, as is Japan, right? The Korean Peninsula really becomes the hot point of a lot of those early wars. Who's going to have influence over Korea? And the anecdote I love telling students is, right after the Meiji Restoration, when half of the Japanese government goes on sabbatical and they go over to Europe, and they meet the Prussian guy Bismarck, right? The real pragmatic guy. He says to some of those Japanese politicians, international law is only for people who are powerful. It's not for you if you're weak. A, and B, Korea is the dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. If Japan's going to have problems, it's going to be through Korea. It's not going to be the Koreans. It's going to be China through Korea or Russia through Korea. Man, was Bismarck right. Yeah.
Is that why they initially wanted to take Korea? Was not out of fear for Korea specifically, but China coming through them?
Yeah, there's this notion that Korea is weak and it'll never be able to hold off internal rebellion, which there was internal rebellion against the Korean king. They'll never be able to hold that off. And so what's going to happen is they're going to turn to either China or Russia for help. And if that happens, then Korea is going to be under influence of either the Chinese or the Russians. And that gives Japan no buffer zone, really, between itself and the rest of the continent. And so this idea of we're going to go into Korea and we're going to modernize Korea and we're going to make a pro-Japanese, modern, strong Korean government. That is the key. And that eventually leads to colonization in 1910. Yeah.
How close were they at actually taking Korea?
Taking Korea, like forming a colony in 1909, 1910 is the colonization of Korea. And so Korea formally becomes part of the Japanese Empire, to the extent that if it's 1920 and you're ethnically Korean, but you're in the United States, like you're a Korean American or something like that, if you're not a citizen of the United States, you are a citizen of the Empire of Japan. You're not a citizen of Korea as such. So from 1910 to 1945, until Japan loses, Korea is part of the Japanese Empire. Schools teach Korean. Teach Japanese language. I remember when in the 90s running into Korean people in the United States. I grew up in the Philadelphia area and meeting older Korean people who could speak Japanese because that's what they learned in school, right? Yeah. So, and the same with Taiwan. Older Taiwanese people who can speak Japanese. That generation is disappearing, but because it was so long ago. But yeah, those were part of the Japanese Empire.
The ideal of the samurai finally taking Korea actually came to fruition.
It's kind of there's a mixed reaction in Japan. Like, should we colonize Korea or not? During the samurai period, Koreans sent embassies to Japan, and they were seen as different. The Koreans always thought of themselves as superior to Japan because Korea had a king and they were connected to China, whereas, Japan just had this shogun, which is just a military guy. And I would say that in East Asia, the military world is looked down upon culturally and socially. It's really the civilians and the civilian intellectuals who are seen as more important in East Asia. So the fact that Japan is governed by warriors is seen as, how barbaric,
Well, that's an interesting dynamic, that they were looking down on that warrior culture.
Yeah, so even in pre-modern Korea, right? There are no samurai in Korea. You have in pre-modern Korea what are called the Yangban, which literally means the two halves. And there's the civilian Yangban who study the Chinese classics and the Confucian classics, and they're educated in that. And then you have the military Yangban who make up the organization of the Korean military. And of those two halves, it is clearly unequal. All the policy decisions are made by the civilian educated side, even in if we were to say like a pre-modern Korean Pentagon situation, right? Even those high military positions are filled by civilian Yangban, not by military Yangban, because the military side of things is looked down upon as being too physical, right? And uneducated. And a similar kind of discrimination exists among Han Chinese in the Ming Dynasty. Qing Dynasty, the last dynasty, is a little bit different because martialness is part of male identity of the Manchu themselves, shooting from horseback and hunting and things like that. But in general, in East Asia, at the level of political philosophy, military is seen as important, but actual combat and things like that are seen as a lesser ability to intellectual learning. Yeah.
How close were the samurai to actually taking over Korea when they invaded? I don't know if it was under the Tokugawa shogunate or if that was a few centuries prior to that. Under the Tang dynasty in China, is that correct?
Right. So we're in 1590s Japan, right before the Tokugawa period. The hegemon Hideyoshi is in charge, and he has this view of he wants to take over China, or at least that's what kind of the consensus is. Some historians say he just wants to force China, the Ming Chinese, to have favorable trade relations or something like that. Whatever his goal was to go through Korea to get to China. Right. His goal isn't really to take over Korea as such. But he sends diplomats to the Korean king, says, yeah, we're coming through to get to China. Thanks for letting us through. And of course, the Korean king doesn't react very well to that. And it's a nightmare situation for the Koreans. Their military was kind of like, you have the military Yangban officers, but it's a conscript army for the most part. And people are supposed to train, but they don't. Wealthy commoners just buy their way out of training and having to serve and just bribe somebody. And there's no warfare in Korea for a long time, so they're not battle tested folks, right? And they face, by the 1590s, a set of armies from Japan that have just finished the Warring States period, where it's very battle tested, right? And organizationally they're on point, and they're veterans, right? So it's a nightmare situation for the Koreans. And it takes 2 weeks for in a pre-modern world, right, where there's no modern infrastructure. Nonetheless, it takes 2 weeks to go from the southern tip of Korea all the way up to, the capital of Korea in the north. It's just a nightmare for the Koreans. Yeah.
And then just saved by Chinese troops in the end?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of the Ming Chinese taking the threat seriously. They didn't at first. The Ming emperor's like, these are just Japanese, they're just this barbaric country. No big deal, right? And then they send a small battalion, and that gets wiped out. And the Ming Chinese, they have their oh crap moment. And they send about 100,000 troops, right? So that's a big plus on the Korean side. And then the Koreans, not to discount their own efforts, they have cannon that work well. And they also have a pretty darn good navy. And that's the weak side of the samurai. You never hear about samurai navies, right? And there's a reason for that. The samurai really aren't good at naval combat. And Admiral Yi Sun-shin, the Korean admiral, he really is a brilliant, both organizationally and tactically, in destroying Japanese ships. And so it's that combined force that really kind of pushes the Japanese back out of the Korean Peninsula. And as I point out to students, this war, the Imjin War, as the Koreans call it, Hideyoshi's invasions, the Japanese campaign, as the Ming would call it, was the largest international war in pre-modern world history. There is no war larger than this war in the 1590s. Okay. The Japanese or the Japanese warlords sent 120,000 troops. Ming sent 100,000 troops. The largest army at that time in Europe is maybe the Spanish army, which has at most 70,000, right? So you have armies that dwarf anything the Europeans could put together, and it's all in the Korean Peninsula. And in fact, as I like to point out, it takes the Korean economy about 200 years to recover from that devastation, the size of that war. Yeah, yeah.
Wow, that's a serious amount of time.
That's right, yeah.
That was interesting too, coming across in your book, the ear mound in Japan.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Where they had cut noses and ears, but noses off of Koreans and brought them back to Japan and then buried them in this mass grave that is now like a cultural heritage site.
Yeah, it's not, the optics aren't great for Japan on this one, I guess, as we would say. Yeah. Yeah, because part of the way that you get paid as a samurai or as a combatant in general before the Tokugawa period is you would decapitate someone, and at the end of the day's fighting, you might bring the head to a local general, and you would say, "Here are the guys I killed," or you would take ears or noses, something like that. And so that practice becomes very inconvenient tactically. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure this out, right? If you're decapitating someone you just killed and someone comes up behind you and kills you, right? It's not the greatest way to organize a mass warfare, right?
And bringing 20,000 heads back would be a little challenging logistically.
Yeah. So, but nonetheless, the practice kind of still remains even during the invasion of the Korean Peninsula. Yeah, and so, trophies are taken, slaves are taken. A lot of Korean slaves are taken. Mostly slaves who are artisans and intellectuals, because Korean pottery was seen as the best pottery to get your hands on in Japan. And so instead of just stealing pottery, you can steal the potterers, bring them back to your domain, and force them to create a little pottery industry that you can monopolize. So a lot of slaves. Korean intellectuals, scholars of Confucianism and stuff are kidnapped and brought to Japan to kind of fill out the intellectual ranks of a local lord or something like that. And so a lot of trophies are taken, slaves are taken. Yeah.
Going from invading to being invaded, I wanted to ask about the Mongol invasion and how true that idea of, the wind in the ocean being a strong repellent against the invading army.
Yeah. Thomas Conlon, he's a scholar. I think he's at Harvard or Princeton, one of those. And he wrote this wonderful book called In Little Need of Divine Intervention, in which he makes the argument that the whole Kamikaze, the divine wind that comes in and blows away the Mongol forces, is mostly a fabrication of after the Mongol invasions, when families are trying to boost their reputation and say, hey, and temples as well, see, our praying and our chanting had actual concrete intervention in this military campaign, and so we need to get paid, or something like that. I'm kind of generalizing here. But I would say that, as far as I know, there were storms and they did have an effect. But I also think that it was probably overemphasized, that there is, in fact, during the second invasion, the Kamakura shogunate is able to organize a defense that is effective down in that island of Kyushu, way down in the southwest. And so that's a big part of it as well. So that combined with a storm, I think, is kind of where the truth is, probably.
Somewhere in the middle. It's interesting that they would downplay their own efforts in favor of divine intervention.
Yeah, I think here the key is, because there's no national army, every group wants to advance its own position on the Japan side. Temples, don't really send armies, but they see themselves as being efficacious through the, almost like the war magic, the combat magic side of things, the spell casting. And families who support those temples want to be seen as, haha, see, where we did all this we supported these temples that did this chanting and all that kind of thing. I think that's where it is. Yeah.
It's a little more unifying in that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mike, thanks for sitting down and talking with me, man. I really appreciate having you on.
Oh, no problem. It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
What's your next book coming out on? Is it late 19th century onward? Can you talk about it or?
Yeah, a little bit. So I have a book that I'm still writing. I'm kind of in the end stages of the first draft, and it's kind of tentatively titled "Politics of the Sword: Violence and Ideology in Tokugawa Japan," and it's kind of starts in the 1600s. But I think the focus that I'm going for is really in that latter half of the Tokugawa period, where I kind of feel more comfortable about the research and stuff like that. So I don't know if it'll ever get published or anything, but that's kind of what I'm working on. And I've done some little articles here and there kind of related to that topic of swordsmanship and stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, we'll be on the lookout for that.
Awesome. Thanks.
Do you want to plug any of your other work where people can find you, find your book?
MichaelWert.com, all one word, is where people can fill in a contact form. It also has links to other media stuff that I've been in, links to, books in different languages that I have and that sort of thing if people are interested.